All right, here goes.
This is a Two Fat Guys Pull List podcast.
Let's talk about your work with the official handbook with Marvel, and what was the most interesting that you may have discovered?
Masher joined the Avengers during Jonathan Hickman's run. Jonathan Hickman, another one of my favorite writers. He is the descendant of somebody who was heavily implied to be a captain in space, which ended up, there's a whole reason why that didn't make sense, but it was heavily implied. And then she is now part of a space federation. And she was born in Iowa, near a river. And Captain Kirk was born in Riverside, Iowa. So I was like, can I say Riverside, Iowa? And Hickman said, if I didn't explicitly say it, don't add it. All right. So it just says an unrevealed location in Iowa, but I really wanted to say that she's from Riverside, Iowa.
Yeah.
Origins of superpowers are always very interesting.
There's more to them than meets the eye.
We're opening the magnetic field.
Your real training begins now. Ready?
Stand by alert.
What up, comic fam? It's your boy Jim, and you're watching Secret Origin, the show where we talk to comic book writers, artists, podcasters, and content creators about the one thing that we all love, the one thing that brings us together, and that's comic books. And I'm joined today by Kevin Garcia, writer. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I had a friend, Chris Luby, I think met you at a con and mentioned about how you were a writer for the comic book guide, handbook guides.
Yeah, the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Yeah. Although I will say there's a difference between the official handbook of the Marvel Universe and Marvel Encyclopedia. Marvel Encyclopedia is done out of Marvel. They use our material, but they're not part of Marvel. The handbook people are all actual Marvel employees. And it's kind of a sore spot for a lot of them. They're like, don't call us encyclopedias. We're the handbook.
Gotcha. Yeah, hey, it's when you do that, you got to be picky for sure. Well, before we start the main part of the show, we're going to get into like a rapid fire section where we're just kind of calibrating the vibe of the show. So, are you down for it?
Sure, go.
All right, here we go. So, first up, what Marvel or DC character deserves a TV show or movie that doesn't already have one?
When you put it like that, it makes me think Namor showed up in Wakanda Forever, and I honestly think they could do a whole lot more with him. But then I'm thinking they never made a Hulk movie or TV show. Well, they did the first one, I guess, but after that. And they instead did a She-Hulk TV show. And I'm thinking to myself, Namora was in the movie. I would love to see a spotlight on Namora, especially with this indigenous angle on it. It gives a whole bunch more to that history. It'd be a neat, different take. And it's something that's untested waters, pun not intended.
Who's more overrated, Superman or Captain America?
I think both are underrated. Mainly because people tend to reduce Superman to his powers, and people tend to reduce Captain America to his costume. And neither one really sells the character right, in my view. Like, people ask me what my favorite Superman movie is. My favorite Superman movie is Captain America: The First Avenger, because that's the way Superman should act in a movie, and we haven't really had that. I mean, we did with Christopher Reeve, but we haven't really had the fully selfless Superman that needs to be out there. Whereas Captain America, he has barely gotten a chance to shine in the MCU. So I'm like, there's so much more for both of those characters. I think they've been undersold.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what Gunn does with the character and really his whole take on the DC universe. I'll be very interested to see that.
I'll be honest, I wouldn't say worried, but I'd say not interested in it until I saw the dog. As soon as I saw the dog, I'm like, all right, I'm all in. If you're going to finally give us a real, I mean, they got a live action crypto in the TV show, but if you're going to give us a real movie live action crypto, I am all in.
All in. All right. Do you have a favorite anime or manga?
All right. So I guess my favorite manga is, because I don't read a lot of manga. You'd think I would read more. I don't read a ton. My favorite is actually called Yotsuba, although it's Yotsuba and an ampersand and an exclamation point. So I always say it as Yotsuba and because it's by the creator of Azumanga Daioh, and it's about a little 4-year-old girl with green hair, and everything is exciting to her. She was raised in a small little secluded area with her dad, so now that she's in the big city, she's like, "What's that?" And they're like, "It's an air conditioning." "What's it do?" "It cools us." "That's amazing!" And it's just so great seeing the world through this little girl's eyes. Every time there's a new volume of that, I pick it up immediately.
When it comes to comics, do you pick them up on Wednesday or later in the week?
Wednesday, although I will admit that I have switched to digital over the past couple of years. primarily because of just practicality. I was so overflowing with comics that my house was full of them. My dad's garage was full of them. And I didn't even realize this. A friend of mine's house had them from years ago. So I went ahead and sold like 30,000 comics that I'd collected over the years. And so now when I buy new ones, I buy them digitally. The only ones I buy physically are the things that are not likely to get reprinted.
All right. Now, this is the last question. This is the hard-hitting one. This is the one that really just like defines the show. Is oatmeal a soup?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
It has a thick consistency, but it's liquidy enough, especially depending on how you make it, that it needs the bowl for support. And without that bowl, it just wouldn't exist. So yes, it is a soup.
That is our first yes since we've started the show. So I'm very happy with that. All right. Well, that was the rapid fire section. Let's go ahead and get into the meat of it. First question will be, what is the first comic that made you fall in love with the medium?
You know, it's kind of funny. I fell into comics in a weird way in that I was the oldest of my siblings and cousins and stuff, but I was the youngest of my friend group. And for whatever reason, my friend group decided that whenever we played video games in the 80s, it was going to be by age. So I was always the last to play. So while they were all playing the Nintendo, I would be going through my friends' comics. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like I would see this purple guy who time travels. Like, what's that all about? And then I would see there was an issue of Captain America where Dr. Octopus tentacles showed up. And I was like, what's going on? But my friends were telling me they were excited about this new thing coming out called Ninja Turtles. And one day I saw it at a gas station. I'm like, I'm going to show all my friends I got this, and they didn't. And I go to show them, and they're all like, cool. But I was hooked. I bought every single issue of Archie's Ninja Turtles. I went back and bought the Mirage issues. I was overwhelmingly consumed by this entire world built around these utterly ridiculous, mostly naked characters.
Yeah, so my sons are just now getting into Ninja Turtles. And they're like, hey, they've got a cartoon. They've got a cartoon on TV. And I'm like, yeah, but there's a comic. And they're like, what? This summer I took them to the comic book store and they got to see them and they were like, can we get them? I'm like, absolutely, we can get them. Let's do it. So they're diving into Ninja Turtles as we speak right now when it comes to comics. So yeah, I love that. Who are some of your favorite comic book writers and artists, and what makes them stand out to you?
Kurt Busiek is one of my favorites, going back to the 90s, going back to the Marvels, because he just perfectly integrates continuity into new stories. Like, if you don't know the old stories, you can still follow along. If you do know the old stories, it adds new levels to it. It bothers me, for example, with Namor. Every time there's a new Namor series, the writers come on as if they're the first person to ever write this character. And it's like, we're going to reveal something you never knew about him, which is the same thing that was revealed from the last person, but somehow contradictory, that kind of stuff. More recently, Donny Cates has been one of my favorite writers. He's actually from the Austin area like I am. What I love about his work is that similarly, he would take characters that had not been well written for a long time and then done some amazing stuff with them. Best example to me is Thanos. Thanos is one of my favorite characters, and yet, other than Jim Starlin, it seems like nobody can write him. And in fact, the Thanos series that Donny Cates took over up to that point was one of the worst comic books I'd ever read, but I was picking up every issue anyway for some, I don't know, reason. And then he came on, and suddenly I was in love with Thanos' character again, and he made me care about death again when I didn't like the way Marvel's death had been depicted for years. It'd been a long time, and he made both characters both fit into the actual continuity, but also revive what I cared about them. And he did the same thing with Doctor Strange, and I'm pretty sure his Doctor Strange was only supposed to be a fill-in arc between, regular creators, and it was an amazing, amazing run.
So when I got into the hobby, which was right before the pandemic, me and my friend Nate, who's also on the show, we got into comic books, and the first thing that I picked up at the shop was his Thor run, was Danny Cates' Thor run.
Oh yeah.
And it just oh my gosh, talk about metal, you know what I mean? That's how I describe his Thor run, is just it's just epic and metal. And then the guy that owned the shop goes, hey, have you read his Thanos run? I was like, I don't know nothing about this person. And so when I read his Thanos run and they introduced Cosmic Ghost Rider.
Yeah, and that's the thing most people care about. Most people get Cosmic Ghost Rider from that run, but there's just so much more to that run that I love.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, the Thanos, how he depicted Thanos and King Thanos and all that, was so fun. Donny Cates for me is probably one of my top 5 writers at the moment. I hope he comes back. We'll see.
Well, he's come back a little bit already. I don't know the full details, but I know something happened to him because his Thor run definitely got cut short. He had set up a whole bunch of stuff, and then they kind of had to wrap up what they could. And then we have a new writer taking over, which I really love the current run, by the way. I think it's Al Ewing, who's an amazing writer as well. His Defenders books it blew me away. But I feel like they're still leaving the door open for Donny Cates to come in and really finish that storyline, and I'm really hoping for that someday.
Especially with Thanos with the Black Infinity Stone, like that whole thing. I'm ready for it. How did your background in education and journalism shape your approach to storytelling in your comics?
It's funny. I didn't really think of it that way until I went back and looked at the stuff I've been doing recently, and that I've been a professional writer now for over 25 years, and a professional educator for over 18 years. And as I like to say, my education career is now legally able to vote, and my writing career can rent a car without paying extra money. But I didn't really think about it influencing my writing until I realized that, the book I did about the Aztecs was a book about history and trying to retell it with a ton of research. And then the superhero book I just did is about history being told through the lens of comic books. So both of them is taking in both education and the research of journalism into my stories. I didn't realize I was doing that until I looked back and I was like, oh, I guess I do have a niche.
Well, speaking of the comic book that you wrote about the Aztecs, TEOATL, what inspired you to tell that original story and approaching a historical accuracy with compelling narrative elements? Well,
TEOATL came about because I was tired of seeing movies and shows and stuff like that about and by the way, I'm going to say the word Aztecs, and some people will jump in on that, say that's not accurate. And it's kind of accurate, but also largely isn't. The people, when we say Aztecs, we're usually talking about the Mexica, but it wasn't just the Mexica. It was actually them plus a couple others, what we call the Triple Alliance. So it's a whole bunch of things. But we say Aztec because that's just the common term now. It's like when you say Germany instead of Deutschland, you know what I mean? But anyway, so I think my trouble with the Aztecs and also Maya and other people of Mesoamerica is that whenever there was a new story told with them, it was like nothing mattered until the Spaniards showed up. And my best example of that is Apocalypto by Mel Gibson, which, that guy. But in that movie, it's the first movie that is 100% in an indigenous Mexican language. And yet it ends with the Spanish showing up to save the day, which is a little bit of the director's Catholicism jumping in. And the thing is that I hate that. So I wanted a story set where there could not possibly be any Spaniards. And so it is set 200-300 years earlier. And then on top of that, I love history and I love oral tradition. And Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, has a mythology around it. And it's not like a single one. It really drives me nuts when I see I want to say influencers, but I guess TikTokers, YouTubers, that kind of stuff. They're like, this is exactly the way it was. When there is no one way when you're talking about oral tradition, there's always a variety of ways.
Right.
So I looked at various sources that going back to right after the conquest all the way to today. And I know that the ones written after the conquest are going to be tinged by the Spanish monks that are writing it, so of course, but I'm taking that into account. And going through all of these different accounts, I came up with 4 distinct origins for Tenochtitlan that don't match with each other. Like they do not mesh. They're all entirely different origins. So I said, well, I'm going to mix these into one origin and have a main character. And because the Mexica kept such good records, every single named person in my story is somebody that we know was alive in the Valley of Mexico in 1325. So everybody there, except for one person. One person only shows up in legends. We don't have her name, so I just called her Choco, which means daughter. And so I have them all there. And I only ever told chapter 1. And the reason for that is 2020 was a very stressful year. I had intended to publish that book and rather promote it on fundraisers and stuff, crowdfunding and stuff in March of 2020. And I had always had this everybody's got irrational fears, right? Like I had irrational fear of heights or irrational fear of spiders. My specific irrational fear was I've spent so many years writing other people's stories that when I finally write my own story, there's going to be an apocalypse and it won't have a point anymore. And literally the day I was going to announce it, everything got shut down. So it was like my specific irrational fear went off. And it was a stressful time. So I had to step away from writing for a while, and I went back to doing research and stuff, but I stepped away from writing comics. And I would love to go back and tell that complete story of the origin of Tenochtitlan. But if I do, it would be starting over again from chapter one. I'd have a new artist, a new team, hopefully an editor this time. I would really love to have somebody, there to kind of monitor my stuff or that knows the material. And then I put it together probably as a graphic novel, and I do it as a complete story, just so it's all out there. And that's the dream right now. I'd really rather do that with a publisher because, like I said, I want an editor. But that's where I'm at with that. I'm really proud of what I did, but I want to go back in with a fresh mind and not be in the middle of a pandemic.
Outside of, the pandemic, what other kind of challenges did you encounter in writing the story? And specifically, like, about cultural heritage, basically for like readers who may not be necessarily familiar with Mexican heritage.
When we talk about civilizations, the ones that are not around again, people hesitate to say the word ancient because it's only 400 years old, and it's just a little bit older than the U.S., right? But we talk about these older civilizations. A lot of Westerners think, Greece. They think Rome, and if you expand it, people might think, oh, China, or if they go really far back, they're like, oh, Egypt, and all of these things are fine, but there was so much here that needs to be addressed. And when you talk about mythology, you go to any mythology section in any bookstore, you're going to find tons of Greek, tons of Roman. You're now going to find a ton of Norse thanks to Marvel, and maybe a few Celtic things, but you are hard pressed to find Mesoamerican mythology out there. Partially because there's not a whole bunch of it collected, but also because, well, it's not been exposed to the general public. So part of my goal was to essentially tell this story in a way that is pop culture. Tell it a way that, like, it's sword and sorcery. It's Conan the Barbarian mixed with actual like Kirby level, civilizations. Because one thing that really gets me is that when we talk about the Aztecs, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, the Spaniards came to the primitive Aztecs. They had the largest city in the entire world at that time in Mexico. Like, there was nothing in Europe that compared to it. They had technology that Europe did not have. They had flush toilets. All right. They could farm on the water. Like, nobody could do that in Europe. And yet two differences, I guess. Europe had guns, which they hadn't developed, and they had diseases, which they weren't immune to. So it's not that it was like technology versus, the savages. It was two technologically advanced civilizations fighting each other.
Butting heads, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So my approach to the story is I wanted it to be in a way that you could go in not knowing anything about it other than this guy is clearly a hero, that guy is clearly a bad guy, and just move forward. And then the goal being that between my stories and stories by a lot of friends of mine that also write about Mesoamerica, that we can start raising awareness. In fact, I had people ask me, well, this other guy's doing a story about Aztecs. Isn't that going to compete with yours? And I'm like, no. The more people write about this, the more audiences are ready for it. So we help each other out. It's a very, very good community, the Latino creator community.
Let's shift over to your I believe your most recent comic, which is the World's War comic. How did you develop the concept for the heroes who span across generations of World War II to the present day?
The actual start for how the story came about is I was talking to a really good friend of mine, and he owned a comic book store at the time. And he made a comment to me offhand, and he goes, man, why can't it be like the golden age today? And what he meant was, I wish people were buying comics to the level they were buying them in the golden age. In the golden age, a low-selling comic could sell in the hundreds of thousands, and a high-selling one was selling in the millions. Nowadays, the best-selling comics are in the hundreds of thousands, at most, if you're lucky, And so he was like, why can't there be that audience? But my brain went a whole different direction. I was like, well, for the golden age to happen today, it couldn't have happened in the 40s. So that means World War II couldn't have happened. That means the Great Depression couldn't have happened. And if those didn't happen, that means other things would have been different. So I started building this entire alternate history of how the world would be if all those events hadn't happened when they did and were happening now. And then I said, well, how do I get to this alternate history? And that's where I developed World's War Comics. So it came in a roundabout. But then I did a bunch of research. And the way I did it is originally I was going to make some new characters. And then I was like, this is a story about history. I want characters with history. So just like in TEOATL, where every single person in that book who has a name is somebody who we know was alive at the time, every single person who has a name in World's War Comics is connected to somebody who has been published in comics before. Now, they were all public domain characters. So like even tertiary characters are like, well, this character is related to that character, related to that character. I've got whole stupid histories where like the off-brand Archie might be the background of this character here. And the reason for that is part of a little exercise for myself to make them all have a connection, because 90% of this is never going to come up. But I know the history of these characters. I built the whole Bible for myself on these characters. And I don't just mean, I'm searching wikis. No, I read the comics. Because they're public domain, you can read them all. I use a website, comicbookplus.com, that has a whole bunch of them. And I went and read every single appearance of anybody I wanted to use, so I could make sure and either incorporate or change, or maybe say, I don't want to use that guy after all. That kind of stuff, And then, of course, I altered them to make them my heroes. And people have asked me, well, if they're public domain characters, doesn't that mean that the ones you made are public domain? There is currently a movie about Santa Claus right now, starring The Rock, which I don't think anybody's going to watch. That movie still belongs to that company, even though Santa Claus is public domain. If you wanted to make your own Santa Claus movie, you could not make a Santa Claus that is exactly like that Santa Claus, because they will sue you. So these are my versions of these characters, but they are public domain characters. Anybody could use those characters in their own mix and mash kind of way. You know what I mean? All right, so that was a big answer there, but that's the idea. Ton of reading and a weird little origin beginning.
Let's talk about your work with the official handbook with Marvel, and what was the most interesting that you may have discovered?
I was with Marvel for about 10 years. I say about because before I officially worked for them, I did a few things where they just gave me a special thanks. And after I stopped working for them, I still did a few things where they gave me a little special thanks. So I was like, about 10 years. The way it works is with the handbook team, when we're doing the histories of characters, we'd have to read all the appearances, of course. But a lot of times in comic books, when you have a massive universe, some stuff doesn't match other stuff. So then we have to figure out how to make those pieces fit. And especially when it comes to like villains, where they'll die in one issue and then show up just fine the next issue, how do we explain that? And so those in-between pieces, we would either go to the original creators and say, hey, we saw this thing happen. Can we learn more about it? And I got to talk to a lot of creators that way. Or if the creator is dead or not around or just doesn't want to talk, go to the editors and say, look, this is what happened. We have this suggestion. Is it okay? And sometimes they'll say, sure, go ahead and make that change. Sometimes they'll say, well, here's what we had in mind the whole time. And other times they'll say, you know what, just do whatever you want. It'll be fine. And sometimes they'll say, you know what, no, I don't want it changed from how I wrote it, which is fair entirely. So with that in mind, I got to name some characters, give them real names. I got to fill some blanks. And there were some where I was like, oh, but this is so obviously this. And the writer would say, no, you're not allowed to do that. So I'm like, all right, I won't. Big example for me is Smasher joined the Avengers during Jonathan Hickman's run. Jonathan Hickman, another one of my favorite writers. He is the descendant of somebody who was heavily implied to be a captain in space, which ended up, there's a whole reason why that didn't make sense. But it was heavily implied. And then she is now part of a space federation. And she was born in Iowa, near a river. And Captain Kirk was born in Riverside, Iowa. So I was like, can I say Riverside, Iowa? And Hickman said, if I didn't explicitly say it, don't add it. All right. So it just says an unrevealed location in Iowa, but I really wanted to say that she's from Riverside, Iowa.
Yeah.
Other times I get a whole bunch more information. Like with the Blue Marvel, I wrote his profile when all he had at that time was one miniseries. So I reached out to Kevin Garcia, the writer. And for people who don't know who he is, if you've ever seen the Underworld movies, he's the creator of those movies. And he's also in several of them. He plays a werewolf named Braze.
And he talks like this.
And a lot of people think that's a fake voice. That is his real voice.
Oh, wow.
So I contacted him and he's like, well, I won't trust you unless we can talk on the phone. So, all right. So I call him on the phone. First thing he says,
who's stronger, Hulk or Thor?
And I was like, well, and I gave the right answer apparently. So he's willing to keep talking to me. He gave me all this history behind the characters that wasn't in the miniseries. And I also told him some stuff in the miniseries that didn't make sense. Like he had him meeting Namor, but Namor disappeared in 1958. So that means the meeting of Namor had to happen before 1958. So that means Blue Marvel's origin had to be 1957. So all this stuff, we did, back and forth. And he and I have talked a lot since then. We met in person a couple times, had dinner. But yeah, so that kind of stuff happens. I also got a few times, because most of it's just writing straightforward prose, right? But a few times we got to write as a character. So I got to write as the Watcher. I got to write as Steve Rogers, writing his opinions of characters to the president. And the one that I was most proud of is Namor, the First Mutant, #1. They asked me to do the entire history of Namor in like 7-8 pages. And I said, no problem. Can I do it as a character? And they said, well, people want to do that all the time and it never works out. I'm like, well, can I try? They go, fine, but be aware. I submitted it. They loved it, and it printed exactly like I wrote it. I wrote it as Namora, who at that time was revealed to have had a crush on him for 80 years. So she, who's very, very practical, is talking about somebody who she's in love with. And she's doing it as a report to her people at the Agents of Atlas. And so I had that whole story told from her point of view, which is fun because there are parts where she was asleep during. So she's talking about how she learned about it. And there was one part in particular that was never explained. Her daughter, Namorita, was declared the leader of Atlantis in one issue. But the last time we saw Atlantis, Namor's apparent son was the leader of Atlantis, and it was never explained what happened. So I literally had her say, I wish I could have seen how she took power, because we don't know, And so that was a lot of fun. Now, what really drives me nuts about that, though, is that if you go to the digital version of Namor, the First Mutant, they don't include my pages, and it drives me nuts.
Oh my gosh!
It's in the trade, and it's in the physical copy, obviously, but in the digital version, they don't include it. I'm like, why?
Why? Yeah, why is that?
I was told that, maybe they'll save it for a special occasion and re-release it with blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah.
In your workshops and panels, what advice would you give aspiring writers on creating stories that are both culturally rich and accessible to a wider audience?
Well, I give talks on a whole variety of topics. Like I said, I've been talking now at conventions for like 15, almost 20 years. Because I started off going to teaching conventions, then going, comic book conventions, obviously. And more recently, because of the World's War Comics, I've talked about how much is accessible through the public domain, how to use it, how to be aware of stuff. Like, for example, a lot of people are like, well, Mickey Mouse is public domain now. It's like, yes, but also no. Mickey Mouse, his early adventures are public domain. But if you use the character, there's a good chance Disney could sue you, but they probably won't because of the Barbara Streisand effect. If you're wondering why, horror movies come out with Mickey Mouse and they don't sue, because if Disney sued them, it'd be all over the news. And if they leave it alone, it just does, So I'd be careful with those things. I don't care for that kind of stuff. Like Superman. Superman's technically sort of been in the public domain for years if you're only talking about the animated version, So it's tricky. And then you mentioned culturally, that's actually very important because I've been telling people more and more, whatever your cultural ancestry is, lean into it, all right? If you're Black, use that. If you are Chinese, use that. And if you're white, figure out where your ancestors came from and use that, My point is not that you have to do that, but over the past 10 years, there's been an increasing audience for that. People from a community talking about their community, whether it's their present day community or their ancestral community, it doesn't matter. People want to hear that, So I tell people, if you want to really get noticed, more people want to know about that if you are coming from a personal place, whether that's a personal individual story or a personal, family, cultural story, all that stuff,
Switching a little bit of gears here. What's your most controversial comic book opinion?
I hate Endgame.
Hate Endgame.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have actually given an hour-long talk about why I dislike Endgame. It was for an online Comic-Con, and they're like, sure, do it. And then it was all the chat. It was like, what's wrong with you? Yeah, my issue is that I loved Infinity War, and I totally accept the fact that comic book movies are not going to be exactly the comic books. It's just the nature of the business, no big deal. But Infinity War was surprisingly close to the first half of the original Infinity Gauntlet storyline. It was so close that I was very confidently telling people what kind of maybe could happen, you know, and I don't usually do that. I've never gotten to speculation. It's just, it was so much following the pattern. And there had been all these emotional beats that have been built up over these individual movies that in Infinity War seem to be coming to a head. Like, we're going to see what's happening with the Hulk inside. Thor is finally dealing with all this loss. And, the family thing between Nebula and Gamora is finally coming to a head. This is going to be amazing. And then Endgame dropped all of that. There was zero connection to any comic books other than, hey, Hawkeye was once Ronin, so he's Ronin here. You know, there was no reference to the family history of Gamora and Nebula other than let's start over again from ground one. And Hulk literally was solved between scenes. And Thor just became depressed, which is realistic and happens, but there was like so much gonna happen, you know? And then even ignoring that's on me. That's my expectations for the film. You know, that's not the filmmaker's fault, right? That's not their fault. They're not consistent within the movie, right? They literally say, these are the rules of time travel, and then don't follow those rules of time travel. If you're not going to follow them, don't explain them. Hot Tub Time Machine was great because they don't try to explain it. You know what I mean? But if you're going to explain it, follow those rules. And on top of that, they do other things. Like, for example, Captain America's shield. If you told me there's a Flash movie and Flash is going to lose a race, I would be like, what's the point of that? You know, because Flash's whole deal is that he's the fastest. If he's going to lose, oh my gosh, that must mean a really big thing. He's racing against death or something like that. That's cool, right? Captain America's shield, the whole thing is that's unbreakable. Thanos breaks it with some random sword. Not a magical sword, not an infinity gauntlet-powered sword, just some random sword. I hate that. And there's just so much. I could go on. I'm going to stop, but I can go on.
No. I'm glad. I'm actually glad we opened that can of worms. It makes me think
it just cracked that can open. Again, I've talked about this.
Tell us a little bit more about your upcoming comic, 13 Origin CONEJA.
CONEJA is part of this project coming out of Chispa Comics. And Chispa Comics was founded specifically to help Latina creators, you know, make things in comics and also make things about Latino, Latina, Latine people. You know, it's from Latinidad for Latinidad, right? And one of their first, they'd already done some horror books, they'd already done some slice of life books and some comedy books. And their big superhero initiative was going to be called The 13, all right? And the idea being that there are these just kids that when they're teenagers discover they have powers, which, you know, sounds familiar, but that's okay because in this case, their powers are tied to their birthday. I've had people ask me before, hey, what's your sign? And my response to that is, I am neither Greek nor Chinese. So neither of those zodiacs apply to me. But I can tell you what my birthday is in Mesoamerican chronology, you know. And so based on their birthday, that is who they are. I was born on 6 Jaguar, for example. And there are 13 numbers and 20 nouns, mostly animals. And based on what day you are, it's a combination of one of the numbers and one of those nouns, right? So they did the 13 because they were going to have 13 teenagers in order with their birthday, all right? So CONEJA is the 13th, and she's born on 13 Rabbit, all right? So she has rabbit powers. That's where that genesis comes from. When they approached me, they said, here's a list of characters, and all they had was like a one-sentence description, right? And then I could go whatever I want from there. I can design the character, I can rewrite their history, I can give them whatever. And the description I saw for her was Latina Squirrel Girl with rabbit powers. And I was like, yes, I want that. All right. So I basically wrote her as Latina Squirrel Girl with rabbit powers, where she believes the best in everyone. And there's always a way to win because you're going to find the good in somebody. And then I had her fight a superpowered serial killer. Basically, what if Squirrel Girl fought Sabretooth, you know? And,
there you go.
And so that's the fun I had with that issue. And it was really good. Also, another big thing for me was the art. You asked earlier about who my favorite artist was. I didn't really answer that. I have a lot of favorite artists. One of my favorites as a kid was Chris Bachalo, you know, and of course, Alex Ross, and so many others. But in this case, I always feel the art needs to match the story. And since this is about a young Latina, hero, I wanted this kind of webtoon, anime-inspired style. And I knew just who I wanted. I had a list of people, but top of the list, you know, was Martha Ortiz, who had a lot of stuff on Instagram and stuff. But I met her at a convention down on the border. She's from Matamoros, and I loved her style. And when I told the editors about it, they're like, "Yeah, give her a call." And I gave her a call, and she said yes, she would do it. So it's exactly the story I wanted, exactly the art I wanted. So I'm very excited for that. I'm probably going to do more stuff with Chief Spell later on, and I'm currently working on World's War Comics the second issue anyway. And I do want to keep going with that. I want to just keep moving forward and try approaching new things.
I think the thing that's got me really excited about what you talked about is the TEOATL, potentially going back to that and rediscovering that, and maybe coming out with a trade with maybe a Boom or an Image or Scout or whoever.
Oh, man, I'd love to do that.
I think that would be awesome. So, well, Kevin, thank you so much for jumping on with us and for jumping on with me and talking, and just, I love it. I'm glad that you were able to jump on.
Thank you for having me. Although I gotta say, the name seems misleading. You guys are doing all right.
I appreciate it.
No problem.